Hi, I'm Bob Stilker from News Stories, and we're here again with our third News Stories Facebook Live. Today, I'm joined by two wonderful people, Simone Poutnik in San Francisco and Chris Gilmour in Ontario, outside of Toronto. And we're just really glad to be back with you for a second exploration of the spiral of co-creating. Simone is this amazing conflict facilitator, person who works with many people in different contexts and different situations. We've been working together since 2011 when we met in Zimbabwe at a participatory leadership workshop that we were doing together there. Chris is this guy who, how can I describe Chris? He started out doing survival work, started out living on the land, understanding the land, really being with the land. And he brought that forward to say, what does this tell us about how we prepare for disaster? And then he started saying, wait a minute, let's go beyond preparing for disaster. Let's talk about how the land is actually a context for us to build the communities that we want. Chris and I know each other because of participating in a New Stories and Transition US Stories into Action action learning cohort over the last several months. So Simone and Chris, I'm just delighted that you're able to be with us this afternoon to explore the spiral of co-creating. And I'm going to turn it over to you in just a minute, but I want to begin by going back and doing a very brief review of the spiral, which we talked about for a half hour last week. And technology willing. So all of this is coming to you from New Stories. We're a nonprofit founded in 2000 here in the Northwest that works throughout the Northwest and across North America, as well as in other parts of the world. And the spiral of co-creating is a form that we've discovered through our work. I mean, what we started noticing is that there's different stages that we pay attention to if our intent is to create transformative change, if our intent is to shift systems. And what we see is that there's a normal pattern of 6 different stages that first of all, it starts with listening. It starts with really leaning in and suspending judgment, suspending disbelief, suspending our assumptions, and really listening to each other to discover what else is possible, to discover what else is present. And from that listening, what happens? It happens all the time, is that we start to notice something. We start to notice a pattern across what 3 or 4 or 5 people have said. And that pattern begins to take on a name. Once the pattern has a name, once it's something that we can actually refer to and come back to, it makes it possible to invite others in and to connect people who care about that same name, care about that same thing. They come together. They start to talk with each other. They start to listen. And as they do that, one of the things they often find is they need some other nourishment. They have their own ideas. They have their own experience. And those take them so far. But then they need to reach out further. They need to reach out and bring in other perspectives, other ideas, other knowledge about how do we work in this domain, whether it's food or energy or disaster, doesn't matter. So we start with the listening, we go to the naming, we connect people, we nourish them. And then what happens is it's time to act. We've got enough, we don't know everything, but we've got enough to take a next step. We've got enough to begin. We've got enough to try something and then step back and see what happened, listen to it, and decide what it is we try next. And when we do that, part of what starts to happen is we get results. We take those results and we illuminate them. We make them visible, both back to the people who are doing the work, and we illuminate them out to a broader field, because that illumination becomes the way to attract more people, more resources to whatever piece of work we're engaged in. Now, that's a real quick overview. And that's all I'm going to do for right now. Let's go back and let's see what Chris and Simone know about this spiral of co-creating and how it shows up in their work?
Sure. Well, I could start chatting there, and it's actually been really fun. So I was just introduced to the spiral literally a couple of days ago when Bob invited me to come on the cast. And it's kind of fun. I sat down for about an hour today with a coffee and was just kind of jamming on how many of these things have naturally occurred in my process and things I've observed in the last number of years. And I like to think a lot of the way that I interact and go about things is based on what I observe from nature and have learned from nature over the years. So I've been actually having a lot of fun kind of looking at this spiral and just kind of overlaying the two together. And I found it actually quite illuminating for me, to kind of just have a bit more of awareness of it as a conscious model that you could actually work with, I'm a guy that likes models. I love playing with different forms of models. But maybe I'll just share a couple of the highlights that have kind of come up for me in my reflection on this. And when I think about the first layer there of the spiral, the listen piece, and I think back to two components of my background. One is in permaculture and growing. And I think that, the first principle of permaculture is to listen to the land. And it's kind of one of the hardest ones when you start in a new project. We want to jump in and superimpose all of our ideas onto the landscape. And really, a lot of permaculturists will say, you want to sit on the land for an entire year and observe the cycles right through before you really take any big interactions and really listen to what does the land want, And then to think about a second piece of it, another passion of mine has been wilderness survival and kind of ecology, survival living. And I've learned the hard way many, many times that if you try and impose your idea on the land in a survival context, you often get a very harsh awakening and learn how powerful the land is. And now when I'm teaching kind of survival skills and wilderness stuff, my approach is often to say, your first step is actually to sit and listen and say, what's being asked of me right now? What resources is the land offering to me? How can I work with those resources in a way that's symbiotic to me and the other creatures that I have to live with there, And if we got some more time later, I can tell a couple stories of being very humbled by not listening to the land. And then how those have taught me about it. And it's kind of funny, though. I think about how that's, been a part of the way that I've been the last number of years. But it's only been recently that I've been starting to actually apply that to, business and projects. And I was realizing, cool, I teach this one thing and I practice it in the woods, but something shifts when I go into okay, we're going to organize a conference, or I'm going to put a workshop together, or I'm working on this business and I need to make some money from it. And then I tend to really get into my head. And suddenly those two pieces kind of fade into the background once that idea pops in there. So my passion, I'm working on this project right now, I'm calling Changing World Project. And it's basically trying to bridge my three passions, which are traditional connection to the land, wilderness survival, knowledge of place and ecology, with modern day, the best of emergency and disaster preparedness, knowing about some of the uncertainties around the next corner and the times that we live in. And then bridging that with kind of self-reliant skills, as well as community. So really, you could even say 4 pieces in there that I'm really passionate to bridge right now. And so I went into this project. I was going to start this blog and this website, changingworldproject.com. And I went into it in this very Western mindset, and I started dreaming up all these big ideas and went in full force and spent a ton of energy on it. And I was literally sitting in a tree last fall and had this moment of just being I'm not excited about this. I'm not actually listening to my own connection with the land and what I'm building. No one cares or wants what I'm building right now. I'm just putting tons of information. And when I stop to listen, I'm I have information that I think is useful. But when I stop to listen to the people that have been attracted to the kind of mentoring I've done, everyone's in information overload. There's tons of information out there. And just creating more information on preparedness is not really what the world needs, So I had this beautiful moment sitting in this tree of listening to what is not there. And, Bob, you introduced this thing during our cohort, this concept you've been working with of curate, create, convene. And I guess the curate piece is kind of like the listening piece. So in this curate process, I started listening and thinking, people don't necessarily want more information. We don't have a lack of preparedness because the information is not already out there about how to do it, So I started listening to that. And then it kind of shifted me to the create phase. Okay, so what can we create to kind of fill in those holes? And kind of the ironic piece coming out of it is I wrote, it was minus 20 degrees that day when I was sitting in the tree. And I was shivering quite a bit. And I ended up writing a blog post about what we can learn from wildlife to make us more hardy to the cold and to the winters and extreme cold. And it actually blew up, and it was the most read post I've ever written when I actually really listened to that connection piece. And that was a real, just kind of a real beautiful moment for me of when I stopped to actually listen to what my connection to the land and what informs me, and listens to what do people actually want. It was very different than the idea I went into the project with my head. And now I've been in this process of, like you said, naming the shift. And for me, naming the shift, the kind of second step of the piece, has really started with like naming what are some of the issues that are holding us back, so that I can name what is this new thing that needs to be created that fills in some of the holes that I think I can do through this merger of a kind of knowledge of place and ecology. So that's been kind of a fun place. And maybe I'll just share one really quick story and then I'll pass it on, just to not take up too much time here. But I was teaching an emergency preparedness course down in Toronto a little while ago, and this mom was in the course, and she told me that the evening before, she was out at a party, and she told a bunch of her friends she was going to the survival course, where they learn how to purify water and make kits. And everybody kind of laughed, and she's like, oh, you're preparing for the zombie apocalypse and yada, yada. And she came, what she said to me that's really interesting though, is after dinner, she said multiple different women, like half of them came over to her one-on-one and said, hey, can you tell me more about that course? I'm actually really concerned about that. So there's this elephant in the room that people feel like that the world's really shifting, but we haven't found a language that makes people comfortable to talk about it. You're either like a prepper, zombie survival kind of guy, or you're, maybe a radical environmentalist, or you're just kind of ignoring it, but it doesn't mean that you don't feel it. So my kind of name the shift piece has become getting obsessed with listening to what are the things that are holding people back from talking about it, and what is the language that we can use that makes it safe to talk about this and is actually empowering instead of building fear. And I could keep going on that, but I'm going to kind of leave it there and really say that where that's brought me to is the third piece, which is, okay, now let's connect with all of the innovators. And that's how I met Bob. I heard about this cohort, and instantly I was like, wow, I've got all these questions about, what is the language? How do we name this in a way that's actually empowering and feels good? And the cohort came in started just as I was asking these questions. And now I've got the amazing opportunity to connect with innovators like Bob and then now Simone. So maybe I'll pass it over to you right now and leave it there for now.
Thank you. Yeah, so in my work, so I work mostly with organizations that have kind of either the internal disasters that show up in form of conflicts, or disasters between organizations or with their communities, with their stakeholders. And they know they need to do something, and whatever they've done so far doesn't work. And so often it comes back to we need to go back and listen. So my sense is that the time is ripe for listening, because people have tried, especially in the helping industries, in the development sector, or community, like even government services or foundations have noticed we've tried so many things, but have we ever really listened? And so that is showing up in many places. And there's one quote that really stands out for me from the Dalai Lama, actually, that every person wants to be heard, seen, and loved, and in this order. And so starting with really hearing somebody and really hearing somebody's concern, and I see that in my conflict mediation work a lot as well. Like sometimes that's all I need to do as a mediator. I only need to listen to people. And then something can, they have a realization of their own part in the conflict, or, they just feel listened to and they can move on. And they're like, oh, I don't actually need to work this out anymore. I can just move on. So that piece, and there's very little capacity, with like the event of social media, and everybody's just broadcasting and talking, but nobody's really listening. So it's not just something we do and you just flip a switch, but like, as Bob said, like when you really listen, you need to suspend your assumptions. You need to, or even before that, become aware of all the assumptions you have in your head about a people that's in front of you, or a situation, or the land, or And that's, yeah, that can be very powerful, and being in a space to be listened to where somebody doesn't harbor all these assumptions can be very healing for people as well, I'm noticing. And then for me, it starts with naming the possibility. So that's often what I see my role as, kind of as a respectful outsider coming into an organization or a context, or a humble outsider, is like, I hear you, I hear your conflict, I see you're in distress, and reframing a conflict as a possibility, or reframing a disaster as a possibility, that can lead to, wanting to create something new. And the other thing that I like about the spiral is that it connects all these elements that we often separate from each other. Like we're either really good at talking about what we're doing, but we're not listening to how it's landing or where it's landing. Or we're just acting, we're wildly acting on something, and we're not looking for the possibility, like where's the opening. But so there is kind of a sequence to it, even though it's not purely, first you have to do this, and then it's kind of organic. There is kind of a flow to this, and after you've illuminated, you need to stop and listen again if something really landed, if people have received. And so many innovators often speak about what they're doing in ways that doesn't land. That's also what I've seen, in a lot of my work with especially social innovators in the Impact Hub network and beyond, in the illumination, to really find the language that can connect with people. And for that, you have to kind of have done all the previous steps. And we see this, in different parts, like there's the event of human-centered design, and, kind of the lean in the startup world, the lean startup, which is all about customer orientation and listening to the needs of your clients. So I think we're in a fruitful time where this listening and this whole spiral is really has a place to land.
Yeah, I want to jump on a couple things. I mean, this whole listening piece, and I loved what you said, Chris, about being up in that tree at minus 20 degrees. I'm glad it's minus 20 degrees centigrade, not minus 20 Fahrenheit. But it's one of the things that I learned in Japan, where my Japanese is adequate, but only just adequate. And I learned that listening is actually a whole body sport. It's not our ears. We have to listen with our whole being. We have to listen with our whole body. And that means just letting go of a lot of the things that we were thinking in advance, and showing up for what is. And there's this incredible chemistry that happens when we do that. When we actually slow down enough to listen and to notice what's going on around us, then new possibilities start to glimmer. And they're not the things that we necessarily thought. They're not the things that we made up in our head. And what you said, Simone, about illuminating, it's like, it's so essential that we share what we're seeing, what we're doing, what's possible. And we have to share it in a way that people can actually get it. So we have to let go of some of the most brilliant language that we're able to use in describing things. And something else, I'll just throw in one other piece that's been coming up for me lately. There's this whole discourse around innovation that's come out of Silicon Valley and other places where, phrases like fail early, fail fast are really popular. And part of what I've been coming to recently is that, it may be fine to fail early and fail fast when you're working with an iPhone design. But actually, it's not a very sharp idea to fail early and fail fast when you're working with people who are homeless. So it's like we have to look at some of these things differently. We have to be willing to stretch. We have to be willing to try things that we don't quite know, that we don't fully understand. But there's something about being moderate in that. There's something about going ahead, quickly trying something that stretches as far as we can stretch, and then doing that, stepping back and reflecting on it, so that, that next to last step in the spiral of acting, where it is acting, but it's acting just as far as we can see. And then it's this willingness to step back and say, so what happened? What did we learn? What result did we get? And what do we want to do next?
Yeah, just to piggyback on this fail early and fail fast when you work with humans, and how, how that can have fatal consequences for some humans. I think the version, kind of the social business or the social, impact version of that is to engage stakeholders in designing interventions, and and just have more perspectives in the room who can, who are closest to the action. So to involve the end recipient or beneficiary of a service, if you're in a service design as a nonprofit, or so, to involve them in the design rather than doing it for people, doing it with people.
It's kind of cool how that's almost becoming a trend that I'm seeing, because I've actually been studying business a lot the last couple of years now, and which is hilarious because I come from this wilderness background. But what I've become obsessed with lately is, what are those universal principles that kind of cross between disciplines? So what can I take from permaculture that applies to survival, that applies to running a socially conscious business, And it's been really fun kind of playing with that the last couple of years. And what I'm seeing in a shift in business, it seemed like the old model was, the business is like the hero that's, coming up with the ideas and driving culture. And I'm really loving this new trend that's really about what does it look like to actually be vulnerable as a business and kind of co-create the business alongside the people that your business is meant to serve, which is, I think, like the lean startup and the concept behind some of those pieces. And I love what you were saying there. And a part of that is, whether you're creating a business or whether you have a beautiful vision for how to create good change in the world, how do you speak it in a way that people actually hear it and that lands the way you want? And part of that comes from listening to the people you want to work with in that. And that's been just such a beautiful part of my journey the last little while. And it's really shifted. When I was looking into that, like name the shift piece, and looking at why are people not becoming more prepared, looking at all the weather, I was realizing, I was posting, when I first started, I'm putting out all these fearful kind of things like, oh, climate change this and this disaster here and blah, blah, blah. And when I started talking to people about like, doesn't that make you want to do stuff? And people are like, no, like I'm overwhelmed, and like I can barely pay rent, and people are just in this overwhelmed mode. And, the approach that I was originally taking from my head was not landing with people with the intention that I wanted, So it was really neat, when I actually listened and then started asking lots of good questions of the people that I actually was really excited to work with. I ended up, instead of being the one offering the solution, I was kind of getting the solution back from them, in hearing, what is the actual language and what is the motivation there. And, Simone, one piece you said there, reframing as a possibility. And I've actually been finding, in particular, in thinking about adapting to a changing world, adapting to climate change, disaster preparedness, instead of focusing on disaster and fear, reframing as a possibility. Bob, you said, I wrote it down for a second. I was listening, I think it was in your TED Talk, and you said that after the disasters, there was this relentless push for people to get back to the old normal, even though a lot of people didn't like the old normal. And that was kind of this natural thing to do there. As opposed to reframing, this is a new possibility. The story that I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that climate change has actually been happening for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, and that people have actually thrived and survived through many, many different major shifts. And actually, we tend to be in just a relatively stable period of climate in the Earth the last 300 years or so. But that's actually not the norm. You know, if you look at things on a grander scale of things. And I've been really thinking and then starting to tell this story from a more empowering place now about, you know, humans are actually these incredibly resilient people that have made it through so much, and that climate change is actually normal. And sure, we could get into all of the politics of how things may or may not be sped up or whatever, but that's kind of irrelevant to my point. If I'm looking for a more empowering story, I feel like, you know, someone's more likely, that mother or that family that's overwhelmed is much more likely to work with an empowering story about possibility of change and adaptability and resilience than a fear-based message and with tactics about how to survive, you know? And since I've been shifting that approach, I've been having actually a lot of people message and say, wow, I'm really appreciating the new kind of message. And, you know, this is a story that I want to be a part of, you know? When we talk about illuminating the new story, which is, I guess, the last step of the spiral there before it kind of goes back into the listen phase. So I guess my question that I have right now is, you know, what does it look like to illuminate this new story of climate change being a possibility for us to really, really step up and be the resilient beings that we're meant to be, and it being a thing that's actually really old. It's not some new thing, you know?
And just talking about reframe and building on what you just said, like, what if it's not survival of the fittest, but survival of the most adaptive?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah. And the fact that, you know, one of the things I realized when I was just starting my disaster work in Japan, and people were calling folks in the disaster area victims. And it was some of them who started saying, hell no, we're not victims, we're survivors. And that opened up this whole understanding that those of us who are alive today, we're the survivors. We've got in our DNA the capacity to face just about anything. How do we awaken that DNA again? How do we use that DNA? And Simone, you talk about going back to the stakeholders. That's what connecting is about. It's bringing people together to listen to each other and to create with each other, because there's this incredible wealth of knowledge and capacity that's present there.
And remember, Bob, just very quickly, yeah, when we did the listening tour, you know, across the US with this big foundation, and we found out, like, we were sent to listen to what the community problems are, and we found just as many solutions as we found problems in many communities. Just, you know, when you really listen to what people are suffering under, but also what they've created to overcome that, to become resilient, it's incredible the amount of wealth that is there in terms of, you know, strategies and knowledge, if people just have a little bit of you know, support to get going.
It's a perfect place to end. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Chris. And I invite you all to yeah, you're welcome. And I invite you all to play with this spiral of co-creating. And not too long, once one more writing project is done, we're going to be updating a broader description and print of this, and we'll be sharing it here on Facebook as well as through other channels. Next week, we're gonna leave the spiral of co-creating, and we're gonna step into another tool, way of thinking about the world, way of being in the world, that we've been working with at NewStories for quite a while. It has a very elegant and complicated title. It's called The Two Loops, and some of you may have heard it. Two Loops is something that a group of us discovered at Castle Borel in Slovenia about 15 years ago at a global learning village, when we started talking about the journey from an age that's dying to an age that's being born. So I hope you'll come back and join us in 1 week, 3 o'clock on Tuesday, whatever that is, Tuesday the 15th, I think. And we'll have another Facebook Live on The Two Loops. Thanks so much for joining us today. Hope this has been helpful, and look forward to seeing you. Take care.
Ooh, take care, everyone.
Bye.